Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Architect of Dreams. Wade Stewart stood on the marble terrace of his Malibu mansion, watching the Pacific waves crash against the private beach below. At 52, he had built an empire from nothing. Stewart Industries now owned 17 luxury hotels across 3 continents. His calloused hands, scarred from his early days in construction, gripped a crystal tumbler of 30-year-old scotch. 25 years ago, Wade had been a broke college dropout working double shifts at a construction site. That's where he met Vicki Hendricks, a secretary at the contracting company's main office. She was beautiful, ambitious, and everything Wade thought he wanted. Vicki came from old money. Her family owned textile mills in North Carolina, but she claimed to love Wade's raw determination and blue-collar authenticity. Their daughter, Christina Stewart, was born 2 years after their wedding. Wade poured everything into building his empire, working 18-hour days, missing birthdays and school plays, also his girls would never want for anything. Vicki seemed supportive, playing the perfect corporate wife, hosting charity galas, and maintaining their social image. But Wade had always been observant. In recent months, Vicki had become distant, taking weekend trips with friends, staying late at her art gallery that barely turned a profit. Phone calls that ended abruptly when he entered rooms. New jewelry, she claimed, came from vintage estate sales. Christina, now 26 and supposedly working at a nonprofit in San Francisco, had grown cold toward him over the past year. Their weekly calls became monthly, then stopped altogether. She'd graduated from Stanford with Wade's money, yet seemed to resent everything he'd provided. Tonight was different, though. Wade had made a decision that would change everything. He'd installed discreet surveillance equipment throughout the house 3 weeks ago. Not from paranoia, but from strategic thinking. In business, you gathered intelligence before making moves. Wade treated his personal life the same way. The front door opened below. Vicki's laughter echoed through the foyer, followed by a man's voice Wade didn't recognize. They thought he was in Singapore for a hotel acquisition. He deliberately let that information slip during dinner last week, even showing her the fake itinerary his assistant had prepared. Wade moved silently to his home office, activating the hidden camera feeds on his computer. The screens flickered to life, showing Vicki in the living room with a man Wade had never seen. Tall, well-dressed, probably mid-40s. They were intimate, comfortable with each other in a way that spoke of long familiarity. "Are you sure he's really in Singapore?" the man asked, his hands already exploring Vicki's body. "Seth, darling, I told you." His assistant confirmed the flight. "Wade's so predictable. Work, work, work. He'll be gone for 10 days. Vicki's voice carried the contempt Wade had suspected but never heard so clearly. Seth. Wade memorized the name, the face, every detail. This wasn't a new affair. Their body language suggested months, maybe years of intimacy. "And Christina's wedding is set for Saturday." Seth continued. Wade's blood froze. "Wedding?" "Yes, and Wade still doesn't know. Christina and I decided he doesn't deserve to be there. After all those years of neglect, missing every important moment for his precious hotels. This is our revenge. Our perfect family moment without the workaholic father who was never really present anyway." Seth laughed. "I love how your daughter thinks. She gets her devious streak from you. Christina understands that Wade is just a provider, not a father. She knows her real family now." Vicki's words cut like surgical instruments, precise and designed to inflict maximum damage. Wade watched for another hour as they discussed details, the wedding venue, the guest list that deliberately excluded him, how they'd been planning this betrayal for months. His daughter's fiancé was apparently someone from Seth's social circle, another detail Wade had been kept ignorant of. By midnight, after Seth left and Vicki went to bed, Wade had compiled a complete dossier. Seth Riley, investment banker, divorced, 2 children he rarely saw. 44 years old, lived in a penthouse downtown that Wade's research showed was leveraged to the hilt. More importantly, Seth had been embezzling from his clients' accounts, something Wade's forensic accountant had uncovered within 3 hours of being given Seth's financial records. But Wade wasn't interested in simple exposure. That was amateur hour. This betrayal required something more profound, more permanent. His wife and daughter thought they were dealing with a predictable workaholic who could be easily dismissed. They had no idea they just declared war on someone who'd built a billion-dollar empire through strategic thinking and ruthless execution. Wade opened his laptop and began making calls. His contacts around the world, lawyers, private investigators, government officials who owed him favors, would be instrumental in what came next. By dawn, he had the framework of a plan that would destroy both Seth and Vicky systematically, while teaching his daughter the most expensive lesson of her life. The construction worker who'd clawed his way from poverty to power was about to show them why he'd never lost a fight that mattered. Chapter 2. The Web Titans. 3 days later, Wade returned from his fake Singapore trip to find Vicky playing the loving wife, asking about his meetings and expressing concern about his fatigue. Her performance was Oscar-worthy, tender touches, interested questions, even suggestions for a romantic weekend getaway. How was the Meridian acquisition? She asked over breakfast, pouring his coffee with practiced perfection. Challenging, but successful. The Singapore team exceeded expectations. Wade had actually spent those 3 days in a downtown hotel, coordinating his investigation and setting the first phases of his plan in motion. Christina called that evening, the first time in 2 months. "Hi, Dad. I know I've been terrible about staying in touch." Her voice carried forced warmth. "I've been meaning to call you. It's good to hear from you, sweetheart. How's work?" "Actually, Dad, I have some news. I'm engaged." Wade's grip tightened on the phone. "Engaged? That's wonderful. When did this happen?" "Recently. His name is Orlando Dotson. He's amazing, Dad. You'd love him." The lies flowed so easily. Wade had already learned that Orlando was Seth's cousin, a trust fund addict with gambling debts exceeding $2 million. "I'd love to meet him. When can you bring him home?" A pause. "Well, actually, we're thinking of having a small ceremony. Just close family and friends. Nothing elaborate. Of course. When are you thinking?" Another pause, longer this time. "This Saturday, actually. I know it's short notice, but we found this perfect venue and—" "This Saturday?" "Christina, that's impossible. I have the Jakarta opening on Monday. The entire board will be there." "Understand, Dad. Work comes first, right? It always has." Her voice shifted, becoming colder. "Mom said you'd probably be too busy." The accusation hung in the air. Wade realized this was the test. Would he choose family or business? They designed it perfectly, knowing his reputation for never missing major corporate events. "Sweetheart, if this is important to you, don't worry about it, Dad. We'll take lots of pictures. You can see them when you have time." The line went dead. Wade stared at the phone, marveling at the sophisticated cruelty of the setup. They deliberately scheduled the wedding during his Jakarta opening, then used his choice to justify excluding him. It was psychological warfare disguised as family dynamics. Vicky appeared in the doorway. How did Christina sound? Distant. "She mentioned some wedding this weekend, but it conflicts with Jakarta." Vicky's expression shifted through a series of micro-emotions. Surprise that Christina had called at all, concern about what she'd revealed, calculation about how to manage the situation. "Oh, that. Yes, she mentioned something about that. I think she understands how important Jakarta is for you." Her tone was supportive, understanding, the perfect wife backing her husband's career priorities. Wade nodded slowly. "I suppose you're right. The Jakarta opening is crucial. I could attend for both of us," Vicky offered. "Take pictures, represent the family." "That's very thoughtful. Thank you." That night, Wade watched the hidden camera feeds as Vicky called both Seth and Christina, reassuring them that the plan was working perfectly. Wade was choosing work over family, just as predicted. They could proceed with their perfect wedding, free from a man who'd funded every aspect of their privileged lives. But Wade was already 3 steps ahead. His private investigator had discovered that Orlando Dotson's gambling debts weren't just large. They were owed to very dangerous people. The wedding venue was booked under Vicky's name, with payment coming from accounts she'd been secretly skimming from the household expenses. Most interesting of all, Seth had recently taken out a massive life insurance policy on himself, with Vicky as the primary beneficiary. The picture was becoming clearer. This wasn't just about excluding Wade from a wedding. It was about replacing him entirely. Vicky and Seth had been planning for Wade's complete removal from their lives, with Christina serving as their willing accomplice. Wade opened his secure phone and sent a single text message to his head of security. Initiate Protocol 7. Full surveillance on all targets. Prepare for comprehensive implementation. Protocol 7 was something Wade had developed during a hostile takeover attempt 5 years earlier. It involved complete intelligence gathering, strategic asset positioning, and coordinated pressure points designed to systematically dismantle an opponent's entire life structure. His wife and daughter thought they were playing checkers. Wade was about to teach them chess. By Friday evening, all the pieces were in position. Wade's team had infiltrated the wedding venue, the guest list, and even Orlando's bachelor party. Seth's financial crimes had been documented with prosecutorial precision. Vicky's secret accounts had been identified and were ready to be frozen at a moment's notice. The wedding gift Wade was preparing would be more than just revenge. It would be a masterclass in strategic destruction. Chapter 3. The Call That Changes Everything. Saturday morning arrived gray and overcast. Wade sat in his home office, watching the live feeds his security team had established at the wedding venue. Crystal Springs Country Club, a venue he'd actually helped finance through one of his subsidiary companies, though the current management didn't know their ultimate benefactor was watching every preparation. The irony wasn't lost on him. His own money was paying for the celebration of his exclusion. At 11 a.m., his phone rang. Christina's name appeared on the screen. When I called to ask when the wedding was, my daughter said, "We already got married, Dad. And I only invited people who really matter. Just send the $2 million mansion keys and stop being so pathetic." Wade's fingers tightened around the phone as Christina's voice dripped with calculated cruelty. The wedding hadn't even happened yet. She was calling him before the ceremony to deliver this psychological blow. "Dad, in case you were wondering, the wedding was beautiful. We already finished the ceremony." Her voice carried triumphant malice. "Mom and I decided to only invite people who really matter to us. People who were actually present in our lives." Wade remained silent, letting her continue. "Since you missed it anyway, surprise. Maybe you could just courier over the keys to the Malibu house. Mom mentioned you always planned to give it to me eventually. Consider it a wedding gift. And Dad, stop being so pathetic about work being more important than family. We all know where your priorities are." The line went dead. Wade stared at the phone for a long moment, then set it down with careful precision. Through his computer screen, he could see the wedding was still in preparation phase. Christina had lied about the ceremony being over, adding insult to the already devastating injury. But something else struck him. The demand for the house keys wasn't spontaneous. It was coordinated. They'd planned this psychological attack to coincide with a property grab. The Malibu mansion was worth $12 million, free and clear. They weren't just excluding him. They were robbing him. Wade smiled for the first time in days. They'd just made a critical error. He opened his secure laptop and accessed the legal documents he'd prepared over the past week. With a few keystrokes, he initiated the final phase of Protocol 7. Within minutes, several things happened simultaneously. The wedding venue received an emergency health department inspection, triggered by an anonymous complaint about potential food safety violations. The inspection would delay the ceremony by at least 3 hours. Orlando Dotson's gambling creditors received detailed information about his upcoming marriage to an heiress, along with the wedding venue and time. These particular creditors were known for their aggressive collection methods and poor timing. Seth Riley's investment firm received a flash audit notice from the Securities and Exchange Commission, triggered by meticulously documented evidence of client fund manipulation. SEC agents were already en route to his office. Vicky's secret bank accounts were frozen pending investigation into potential money laundering activities, a legitimate concern given the suspicious transaction patterns Wade's forensic accountants had documented. Most importantly, the Malibu mansion's deed was transferred into an irrevocable trust, with Christina specifically excluded as a beneficiary due to demonstrated financial irresponsibility and hostile intent toward the grander. But these were just the opening moves. Wade's real wedding gift was still being prepared. At 2 p.m., Wade's phone rang again. This time it was Orlando, and he was screaming. "Mr. Stewart, sir, I need your help. These men showed up at the wedding, and they're saying I owe them money, and they're going to hurt Christina if I don't pay, and the SEC just arrested my cousin Seth." And Wade hung up. The phone immediately rang again. Christina this time, sobbing. "Dad, I don't know what's happening. There are these scary men here, and they're saying Orlando owes them $2 million, and Mom's bank accounts are frozen, and Seth got arrested, and..." Wade hung up again. Then Vicky called. "Wade, thank God. Something terrible is happening. The police are here, and these criminals are threatening Christina, and I can't access my accounts, and..." "The wedding gift," Wade said quietly. "What?" "I promised to leave a wedding gift. I delivered it personally." The silence stretched for 15 seconds. "Wade, what did you do?" "I gave Christina exactly what she asked for. Consequences that really matter. From someone who was actually present in her life, just not in the way she expected. You can't do this to your own daughter." "I'm not doing anything to my daughter. I'm simply allowing her choices to have their natural consequences. She wanted independence from her pathetic father. She has it." Wade ended the call and turned off his phone. On his computer screen, he watched the chaos unfolding at Crystal Springs Country Club. Police cars, SEC agents, dangerous-looking men in expensive suits, wedding guests fleeing in confusion. The phone in his office began ringing. The landline they'd somehow gotten the number for. It rang 17 times before stopping. Then it started again. Wade walked to his safe and removed a leather portfolio. Inside were copies of every document, every piece of evidence, every strategic move he'd orchestrated. At the back was a single photograph, Christina at age 7, sitting on his shoulders at Disneyland, both of them laughing. He set the photograph aside and fed the rest of the portfolio into his paper shredder. The landline showed 78 missed calls by evening. Wade never answered a single one. Chapter 4, Unraveling Threads. Monday morning brought a steady rain that matched the storm Wade had unleashed. He sat in his downtown office, 40 floors above the city, reviewing reports from his various operatives. The wedding that never happened had created a cascade of consequences that were still multiplying. His assistant, Marlene Clifford, knocked and entered with a stack of messages. Marlene was 62, had worked for Wade for 15 years, and possessed the rare ability to be completely unflappable under pressure. "Sir, your wife has called 37 times since Friday. Your daughter 41 times. There are also calls from Orlando Dodson, several attorneys, and someone claiming to be from the district attorney's office." Wade didn't look up from his reports. "What's the status on the Jakarta opening?" "Successful. The board was impressed by your presentation via video conference. The hotel is already showing strong booking numbers." "Good. And the other matters?" Marlene consulted her notes with professional efficiency. Seth Riley was formally charged with securities fraud this morning. Bail was set at $5 million. Orlando Dodson is currently in protective custody after the gambling creditors made specific threats against him and anyone associated with him. Mrs. Stewart's accounts remain frozen pending the money laundering investigation. Wade finally looked up. "And Christina?" "She's staying at the Westin downtown. The room is being paid for by your joint credit card, which I assume you're aware of." Wade was indeed aware. He'd been monitoring every financial move his family made for the past week. Christina had been effectively cut off from her trust fund due to the irrevocable trust restructuring, but she still had access to emergency family credit cards. For now, "Marlene, please schedule a meeting with Christina for this afternoon. 2 o'clock. Conference room B." "Sir, should I inform her about the agenda?" "Tell her it's regarding her financial future. That should be sufficient motivation." After Marlene left, Wade turned to the wall of monitors displaying his various business interests. But his mind was on the bigger picture. Seth's arrest was satisfying but temporary. A good lawyer might get him out on bail, though the evidence Wade had provided would ensure conviction. Orlando's situation was more immediately dangerous, but that served Wade's purposes perfectly. The real work was just beginning. Wade opened a secure file on his computer containing detailed psychological profiles his investigator had compiled on each target. Seth was arrogant and overconfident, which made him predictable. Orlando was weak and desperate, which made him manipulable. Vicky was cunning but impatient, which made her prone to mistakes. Christina was the most complex. She had inherited Wade's intelligence and strategic thinking ability, but she'd been raised in privilege and had never faced real consequences. The wedding disaster would either teach her respect or drive her to escalate the conflict. Wade hoped for escalation. It would make the final lesson more profound. At precisely 2 p.m., Christina entered conference room B. She looked exhausted, her usual polished appearance replaced by rumpled clothes and dark circles under her eyes. She took the seat across from Wade without speaking. "You look tired," Wade observed. "Fuck you, Dad." Wade nodded thoughtfully. Vulgarity suggests emotional dysregulation. That's not strategically advantageous in negotiations. This isn't a negotiation. This is you destroying your own family because your feelings got hurt. Interesting perspective. From my viewpoint, you, your mother, and her boyfriend conspired to exclude me from your wedding while simultaneously attempting to manipulate me into transferring a $12 million asset. That suggests the destruction was already underway. Christina's composure cracked slightly. How did you know about Seth? Know about the secret planning? Know about the house keys demand being coordinated in advance? Wade pulled out a tablet and slid it across the table. "I've been in business for 25 years, Christina. Corporate espionage, hostile takeovers, competitive intelligence. These are tools I use professionally. Did you think I wouldn't apply those same skills when my own family declared war on me?" Christina stared at the tablet displaying transcripts of recorded conversations between her, Vicky, and Seth. Her face went pale as she realized the scope of Wade's knowledge. "What do you want?" she asked quietly. "Wrong question. The correct question is, what are you prepared to offer in exchange for my assistance with your current predicaments?" "What predicaments?" Wade smiled without warmth. "Orlando owes $2 million to people who express disappointment through physical violence. Seth is facing federal charges carrying a maximum sentence of 20 years. Your mother's assets are frozen due to money laundering suspicions. You're currently living on credit cards that I control and could cancel at any moment." Christina's hands clenched into fists. "You engineered all of this." "I simply ensure that existing problems came to light simultaneously. Orlando always had gambling debts. Seth was already committing securities fraud. Your mother was already siphoning household funds into secret accounts. I didn't create these problems. I just removed the concealment. So what's your offer?" Wade leaned back in his chair. "Complete transparency moving forward. Full disclosure of all financial activities. Public acknowledgement of your betrayal and a formal apology. Cessation of all contact with Seth Riley. An acceptance of whatever consequences I deem appropriate for your actions. And in exchange, I'll consider paying Orlando's debts. I might provide character references for Seth's sentencing hearing. I could potentially assist with your mother's legal difficulties." Christina stared at him for a long moment. "You've changed, Dad. The man I grew up with would never have done something like this. The man you grew up with was too busy working to pay attention to who his family really was. This is me paying attention." Christina stood up. "I need time to think. You have 24 hours. After that, my offers expire and you'll be managing these situations independently." As Christina reached the door, Wade spoke again. "Christina? The gambling creditors Orlando owes money to? They've expanded their interest to include anyone who might have influenced his financial decisions. That would include his new wife." Christina's hand froze on the doorknob. "Are you threatening me? I'm providing intelligence. What you do with that information is your choice." After she left, Wade returned to his office and placed a call to his head of security. "How are our guests at the Westin?" "Mrs. Stewart checked in 2 hours ago. Same floor as Christina, room directly across the hall." "Perfect. And our other friends?" "The gambling creditors have been provided with Orlando's current location. They're planning to visit him in protective custody." Wade hung up and walked to his window. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained overcast. Perfect weather for what came next. Phase 2 was about to begin. Chapter 5. The Price of Betrayal. That evening, Wade sat in his study reading a first-edition copy of Sun Tzu's The Art of War when his secure phone buzzed. The message was from his surveillance team. Package delivered. All parties present. Wade set down the book and activated the monitors showing the Westin Hotel. Through carefully placed cameras, he could see Christina pacing in her room while Vicky sat on the bed, both women clearly arguing. Across the hall, Orlando remained barricaded in his own room, too terrified to leave after learning that his creditors had somehow discovered his location. The psychological pressure was working exactly as designed. At 9 p.m., Wade's landline rang. He let it ring 12 times before answering. Christina. Dad, we need to talk. All of us. Me, Mom, you. I'm listening. In person. Tonight. Please. Wade checked his watch. The Meridian Hotel. Presidential suite. 1 hour. He chose the Meridian deliberately. It was the crown jewel of his hotel empire, the property where he'd made his fortune, and the place where Vicky had once been proud to host charity events. Now it would serve as the venue for their final reckoning. Wade arrived first, as always. He'd learned long ago that controlling the environment gave you a significant advantage in any negotiation. The presidential suite was opulent but not ostentatious. Understated power, which was Wade's preferred aesthetic. Vicky arrived 10 minutes later, looking haggard and desperate. She'd aged 5 years in the past week. Christina followed 5 minutes after that, supporting Orlando, who looked like he hadn't slept since the wedding disaster. Thank you for coming, Wade said, gesturing to the seating area. Please sit. They arranged themselves on the opposite couch like defendants awaiting sentencing, which, Wade reflected, wasn't far from the truth. I believe Christina has a proposal, Wade continued. Christina looked at her mother, then at Orlando, then back at Wade. We want to make a deal. I'm listening. We'll give you what you want. Full disclosure, public apology, whatever. In exchange, you help us with the immediate problems. Wade nodded thoughtfully. That's a reasonable starting framework. However, I think we need to address the underlying issues that created this situation. What underlying issues? Vicky asked, speaking for the first time. Wade reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. This contains documentation of your affair with Seth Riley dating back 18 months. Bank records showing systematic theft of household funds. Communication records proving premeditated conspiracy to defraud me of property. And, most importantly, evidence of your long-term plan to eliminate me from the family structure entirely. He slid the folder across the coffee table. None of them moved to open it. The problem isn't the immediate crisis, Wade continued. The problem is that you've demonstrated complete contempt for me as a person while simultaneously attempting to rob me blind. The wedding exclusion was cruel. The property grab was criminal. But the systemic deception and planning required for both suggest this isn't impulsive behavior. It's who you are. Vicky finally spoke. Wade, I know how this looks, but how this looks. Vicky, you've been planning to replace me with your boyfriend while stealing my money to finance your new life. How exactly is this supposed to look? Orlando, who had been silent, suddenly broke down. Mr. Stewart, sir, I never wanted any of this. The gambling, the debts, the dangerous people. I just got in over my head, and Christina said her family would help in. Orlando, Wade interrupted gently. You're not the primary problem here. You're just collateral damage from poor choices. Christina leaned forward. Dad, what do you actually want from us? Wade stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. 25 years ago, I was a broke construction worker who fell in love with a beautiful woman. I worked myself nearly to death building something substantial for our family. I missed dinners and birthdays and school plays because I was trying to create security and opportunities for the people I loved. He turned back to face them. I thought I was building a legacy. Instead, I was financing my own betrayal. Dad, Christina started. I want my investments back, Wade said quietly. Every penny I spent on private schools, college tuition, the house in Malibu, the cars, the vacations, the art gallery that loses money every month, the trust funds, all of it. I want it repaid with interest. The room fell silent. Vicky's face had gone white. Wade, that's impossible. We're talking about millions of dollars over 25 years. Approximately $8.7 million, Wade said precisely. I had my accountants calculate the exact figure. That doesn't include the opportunity cost of having the capital tied up in supporting ungrateful family members instead of reinvesting it in business growth. Christina stood up. You can't be serious. I'm entirely serious. You wanted independence from your pathetic father. Independence requires financial self-sufficiency. I'm simply helping you achieve your stated goal. Orlando was crying now. Sir, I can't pay back gambling debts and millions in family expenses. They'll kill me. Wade returned to his seat, which brings us to the alternative proposal. Alternative? Vicky asked. Complete asset forfeiture. I keep everything, the house, the cars, the trust funds, the art gallery, all of it. You start over with nothing but your own abilities. In exchange, I'll pay Orlando's gambling debts and provide each of you with $50,000 in starting capital. The silence stretched for 2 full minutes. And if we refuse both options? Christina asked. Wade smiled. Then you continue managing your current situation independently. Orlando deals with his creditors using his own resources. Vicky navigates her legal problems without my assistance. You figure out how to support yourself without access to family money. He stood up. You have until tomorrow at noon to decide. After that, all offers expire permanently. As they filed out of the suite, Vicky turned back. Wade, I know you're angry, but destroying your own family. I'm not destroying my family, Vicky. I'm simply stopping my subsidization of people who hate me. After they left, Wade poured himself a scotch and returned to the windows. The city sparkled below him, a testament to human ambition and achievement. He'd helped build portions of that skyline through his hotels and investments. Tomorrow would determine whether his family deserved to remain part of his legacy or whether that legacy would continue without them. Chapter 6, The Final Gambit. Wade didn't sleep that night. Instead, he worked. By dawn, he had restructured his entire estate, created new corporate entities, and prepared for every possible response his family might choose. His lawyers had drafted documents covering all contingencies. His security team had implemented additional surveillance protocols. His financial advisors had liquidated specific assets to ensure immediate cash availability. Whatever his family decided, Wade would be ready. At 10 a.m., Marlene brought him coffee and the morning briefings. Sir, there's been a development overnight. Oh. Orlando Dotson was found beaten unconscious in his hotel room. He's currently in the hospital. The police suspect his gambling creditors. Wade sipped his coffee thoughtfully. Condition? Stable, but he'll require surgery for internal injuries. The doctor said he was lucky. If the attack had been more severe, it could have been fatal. And the others? Mrs. Stewart and Christina spent the night at the hospital. They haven't returned to the hotel. Wade nodded. The escalation was proceeding exactly as he'd anticipated. Orlando's beating would clarify the stakes for everyone involved. This was no longer about family drama or hurt feelings. It was about immediate physical danger and long-term survival. At 11:45 a.m., Wade's secure phone rang. Christina, Dad, we need to meet. Now, I'll be in conference room B. No, neutral ground. The coffee shop in the hospital lobby. Interesting. They were thinking tactically now, choosing a public location where Wade couldn't control the environment. Christina was learning. Wade arrived at the hospital to find Christina and Vicky sitting at a corner table, both looking exhausted and traumatized. Orlando's beating had clearly shaken them more than Wade's financial warfare. How is he? Wade asked, taking the third chair. He'll live, Christina said. But they broke 3 ribs and ruptured his spleen. The doctor said if we hadn't found him when we did. I'm sorry that happened. Are you? Vicky asked bitterly. Or is this exactly what you wanted? Wade considered the question seriously. I wanted Orlando to understand the consequences of his choices. I didn't specifically want him beaten, but I'm not surprised it happened. Gambling debts to organized crime syndicates tend to be collected through escalating violence. You could have warned him, Christina said. I did warn him. I warned all of you. The difference is that Orlando's creditors express their displeasure through physical violence, while I express mine through financial and social consequences. Vicky leaned forward. Wade, we've made our decision. Which option? Neither, Christina said. We have a counter-proposal. Wade raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. Christina pulled out a legal document. We give you an uncontested divorce. Vicky waives any claim to alimony or property division. I relinquish all rights to inheritance or family trusts. In exchange, you pay Orlando's gambling debts, and we all walk away from each other permanently. Wade read through the document carefully. It was well-crafted, clearly prepared by a competent attorney. They were offering him everything he legally owned in exchange for approximately $2 million and permanent separation from his family. This is interesting, Wade said finally, but it doesn't address the fundamental issue, which is accountability. Under this proposal, you escape consequences for your actions by paying me to make your problems disappear. That's not justice. That's privilege. Vicky's voice rose slightly. Wade, our marriage has been over for years. We both know that. And Christina deserves the chance to build her own life without this family dysfunction. Our marriage has been over since you started sleeping with Seth Riley. Wade agreed. But the destruction of our relationship doesn't absolve you of responsibility for theft, fraud, and conspiracy. Christina slammed her hand on the table. What do you want from us? Blood. Wade looked at his daughter, really looked at her. She was intelligent, beautiful, and completely unprepared for a world where actions had permanent consequences. In that moment, he realized the depth of his failure as a father. He'd given her everything except the tools to handle adversity. I want you to understand something, Christina. The world outside our family bubble doesn't forgive betrayal because you're sorry. It doesn't ignore theft because you're desperate. The criminals who beat Orlando don't care about his intentions or his circumstances. They care about results. So teach us, Christina said quietly. Instead of destroying us, teach us how to fix this. Wade sat back in his chair. This was the first time anyone in his family had asked him for guidance instead of demanding his resources. You want to learn? Yes. Wade looked at Vicky. All of you. Vicky hesitated, then nodded. Yes. Wade pulled out his phone and made a call. Marlene, cancel my afternoon meetings and transfer $2 million to Orlando Dotson's creditors immediately. Use the emergency accounts. He hung up and looked at his family. The gambling debts are paid. Orlando is safe. Now we start your education. What kind of education? Vicky asked. You're going to learn how to rebuild your lives without my money, my connections, or my protection. You're going to understand what it means to earn everything you have through your own efforts. Wade stood up. You have 1 year. No financial assistance, no family resources, no safety net. At the end of that year, if you've demonstrated genuine growth and accountability, we'll discuss the possibility of rebuilding our relationships. And if we can't do it, Christina asked, then you'll have learned the most important lesson I can teach you, that actions have permanent consequences and some betrayals cannot be undone. Wade walked away, leaving his family sitting in the hospital coffee shop. For the first time in months, he felt something other than anger. He felt hope. Chapter 7, The Wedding Gift. 6 months later, Wade sat in his office reviewing quarterly reports when Marlene knocked and entered with an unusual expression, something between concern and amusement. Sir, you have visitors. I'm not expecting anyone. It's your family, sir. All of them. They're requesting a meeting. Wade looked up from his papers. He'd had minimal contact with Christina, Vicky, and Orlando since their hospital conversation. His private investigators provided monthly reports on their progress, but he deliberately maintained distance to ensure their learning experience remained authentic. Conference Room B. Give me 5 minutes. Wade gathered his thoughts as he walked to the meeting. According to his reports, the past 6 months had been transformative for all 3 of them. Christina had taken a job as a junior marketing coordinator at a small nonprofit, earning a fraction of what she'd received from her trust fund. Vicky had been forced to close her art gallery and was now working as a real estate assistant. Orlando, after recovering from his injuries, had enrolled in community college and was working nights at a warehouse. More importantly, they'd been living together in a modest two-bedroom apartment, sharing expenses and responsibilities for the first time in their lives. Wade entered the conference room to find them sitting together on one side of the table. They looked different, leaner, more focused, wearing clothes that were practical rather than designer. Christina's manicured nails were now short and unpolished. Vicky's expensive jewelry was gone. Orlando had the calloused hands of someone doing physical labor. "Thank you for seeing us," Christina said. Wade took his seat across from them. "You're welcome. You look well. We wanted to give you something," Vicky said, sliding a check across the table. Wade looked at the amount, $47,000. "What's this?" "Partial repayment," Orlando said. "It's every penny we've managed to save over the past 6 months. We know it's not much compared to what we owe you, but it's a start." Wade studied the check. Based on their reported earnings, this represented nearly every dollar they'd made after basic living expenses. This must have required significant sacrifice. "It did," Christina admitted. "But we learned something important. When you're spending your own money instead of someone else's, you make very different choices." "Such as?" Vicky answered. "Such as realizing that we never actually needed most of the things we thought were essential. The expensive restaurants, the designer clothes, the luxury cars, they were just props for an identity we thought we were supposed to have." Wade folded the check and put it in his pocket. "What else have you learned?" Orlando spoke up. "I learned that my gambling addiction wasn't about the money. It was about avoiding responsibility for my own life. When you're living on trust funds and family money, it's easy to believe that your choices don't really matter because someone else will always fix your problems. And when that's not true, then you realize that every choice has a cost, and you're the one who has to pay it." Wade turned to Christina. "What about you?" "I learned that you weren't absent from my life because you didn't care. You were absent because you were building something for us to inherit. But inheritance without understanding its value is just privilege. And privilege without responsibility is just corruption." Wade felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of anger he'd carried for months. "I learned something else," Christina continued. "I learned that the man who built a billion-dollar empire from nothing isn't someone you betray lightly. The consequences will be proportional to the offense." Wade smiled slightly. "Go on. The wedding gift you left us wasn't destruction, it was education. You forced us to face the real world without our safety net. You made us understand what we'd been taking for granted." Vicky leaned forward. "Wade, we know we can't undo what we did, but we wanted you to know that we understand now why it was so devastating. We didn't just betray your trust. We demonstrated that we had no appreciation for everything you'd sacrificed to provide for us." Wade stood and walked to the window. The city below bustled with activity, millions of people working, building, striving to create something meaningful with their lives. "The check is appreciated," he said without turning around. "But money isn't what this was about." "What was it about?" Christina asked. Wade turned back to face them. "Respect, understanding, recognition that the life you were living came from someone else's sacrifice and dedication." "We understand that now," Orlando said quietly. Wade returned to his seat. "I have a proposal." "What kind of proposal?" "You continue living independently for another 6 months. No financial assistance from me. But during that time, you work part-time for various divisions of Stewart Industries. Christina in marketing, Vicky in property management, Orlando in logistics." "What would be the purpose?" Vicky asked. "To learn how the family business actually operates. To understand what it takes to build and maintain something substantial. To see if you have the capability and dedication to be part of it moving forward." Christina's eyes brightened. "And after 6 months? We reevaluate. If you've demonstrated genuine competence and commitment, we discuss your potential role in the family business. If not, you continue your independent lives with my respect, but without my involvement." The three of them exchanged glances. "What about your personal relationships with us?" Vicky asked. "The divorce, the family dynamics?" Wade considered this carefully. "One thing at a time. Professional competence first. Personal relationships will depend on what we build from there." Orlando cleared his throat. "Sir, there's something else we need to tell you. What's that? Christina answered. Seth contacted us last month. He's out on bail pending trial, and he wanted us to testify on his behalf. Said we could present his relationship with Mom as a marriage of convenience that went wrong rather than fraud. Wade's expression didn't change. And we told him to go to hell, Vicky said firmly. What he did to you, what he convinced us to do to you, it was wrong. We're not going to compound it by lying in court. We're prepared to testify for the prosecution if needed, Christina added, to provide the full context of his manipulation and fraud. Wade felt the last vestiges of his anger finally release. These weren't the same people who had betrayed him 6 months ago. They'd been fundamentally changed by the consequences of their actions. The prosecution already has sufficient evidence, Wade said. Your testimony won't be necessary, but I appreciate your willingness to provide it. Wade stood up. I'll have Marlene coordinate your work assignments. You'll start Monday. As they prepared to leave, Christina turned back. Dad, thank you. For what? For caring enough to teach us instead of just destroying us. It would have been easier to just write us off. Wade looked at his daughter, really looked at her. She'd lost the entitled arrogance that had defined her for years. In its place was something harder but more valuable, earned wisdom. Destroying you would have been a waste of potential, Wade said. Teaching you was an investment in your future. After they left, Wade returned to his office and called his head of security. Protocol 7 is complete. Discontinue all surveillance and return to standard security protocols. He hung up and walked to his safe, removing the photograph of 7-year-old Christina at Disneyland. For the first time in months, he could look at it without feeling pain. The wedding gift he'd given them, the gift of consequences, had finally produced the result he'd hoped for. His family was worth saving after all. Chapter 8. Rebuilding Trust. 9 months after starting their probationary employment, Wade's family had exceeded every expectation. Christina had revolutionized the marketing approach for 3 hotel properties, increasing booking rates by 23%. Vicky had streamlined property management operations, reducing costs while improving tenant satisfaction. Orlando had identified inefficiencies in the logistics chain that saved the company over $300,000 annually. More importantly, they'd done it all while continuing to live independently, refusing any special treatment or family privileges. Wade was reviewing their performance reports when Marlene entered with an unusual visitor request. Sir, there's a gentleman here to see you. He says it's regarding Seth Riley. Send him in. The man who entered was tall, thin, and carried himself with the careful precision of a federal prosecutor. He introduced himself as Agent Felipe Powell from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Mr. Stewart, thank you for seeing me. I wanted to update you on the Riley case. Wade gestured to a chair. Please sit. How can I help you? Seth Riley pled guilty to securities fraud last week. He's been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution to his victims. That's appropriate. Agent Powell studied Wade carefully. Mr. Stewart, your family's cooperation was instrumental in building our case. The evidence they provided about Riley's manipulation and fraud was compelling. Wade raised an eyebrow. My family cooperated with your investigation? Yes, sir. Your wife, daughter, and son-in-law provided detailed testimony about how Riley convinced them to participate in his schemes. They were completely forthcoming about their own involvement and eager to help us understand the full scope of his criminal activity. This was news to Wade. His family had never mentioned cooperating with the SEC investigation. I see. There's something else, Agent Powell continued. During our investigation, we uncovered evidence that Riley was planning something much more serious than securities fraud, such as he'd taken out a substantial life insurance policy on you, Mr. Stewart. $5 million, with your wife as the beneficiary. The policy was purchased just 2 weeks before your daughter's wedding. Wade felt a chill run down his spine. Are you suggesting? We're suggesting that Riley's plans went beyond excluding you from family events. The life insurance policy, combined with his accelerating financial crimes and your wife's planned inheritance, suggests a more permanent solution to what he saw as the Wade problem. Wade sat back in his chair. Do you have evidence of actual planning? We found preliminary research on various accident scenarios in his computer files. Nothing specific enough to charge him with conspiracy to commit murder, but enough to suggest he was exploring options. Agent Powell leaned forward. Mr. Stewart, your family's decision to cut ties with Riley and cooperate with our investigation may have saved your life. After Agent Powell left, Wade sat alone in his office, processing this information. His family's betrayal had been devastating, but hadn't been murderous. Seth Riley, however, had apparently been planning something far more sinister. That evening, Wade called Christina and asked her to bring Vicky and Orlando to dinner at his house, the first time he'd invited them to the family home since the wedding disaster. They arrived nervous and uncertain, unsure why Wade had suddenly requested this meeting. Wade served a simple meal he'd prepared himself, something he'd learned to do during his months of solitude. As they ate, he shared what Agent Powell had told him. The reaction was immediate and horrified. "Oh my God," Vicky whispered. "Wade, I had no idea. I thought the life insurance was just financial planning. When did you first suspect Seth's intentions went beyond fraud?" Wade asked. Christina answered. "About 3 months ago, when we were working with the SEC, they asked us about some research files on Seth's computer. They wouldn't tell us what was in them, but the way they asked the questions. We realized we might have been accessories to something much worse than we understood," Orlando added. "That's when we decided to tell them everything, regardless of how it made us look." Wade studied their faces. The horror and guilt were genuine. They hadn't known about Seth's murderous intentions, but they clearly felt responsible for enabling him to get close enough to attempt them. "There's something I need to tell you," Wade said quietly. "I've been watching your work performance over the past 9 months. All of you have exceeded expectations significantly." "Thank you," Christina said uncertainly. "But more than that, you've demonstrated something I wasn't sure you possessed: moral courage. Cooperating with the SEC investigation, knowing it would expose your own involvement in Seth's schemes, took integrity." Wade stood and walked to his safe. He returned with 3 envelopes. "These are offers for permanent positions within Stewart Industries. Christina, Vice President of Marketing. Vicky, Director of Property Operations. Orlando, Regional Logistics Manager." Their faces showed shock and cautious hope. "The salaries are competitive, but not excessive," Wade continued. "You'll be expected to maintain the same performance standards you've demonstrated over the past 9 months. And your personal relationships with me will remain separate from your professional responsibilities." Vicky opened her envelope and stared at the contract. "Wade, this is incredibly generous, but what about us? Our marriage, our family." Wade sat back down. "I filed for divorce, as you know. That will proceed as planned. Our marriage was damaged beyond repair by the betrayal and deception." Vicky nodded sadly. "I understand. However," Wade continued, "that doesn't mean we can't rebuild a different kind of relationship. Professional respect can sometimes evolve into personal friendship, given time and demonstrated trustworthiness." Christina looked up from her contract. "And what about Seth? The life insurance policy, the planning, does that change how you view what happened?" Wade considered this carefully. "Seth's criminal intentions don't absolve you of your choices. You still chose to exclude me from the wedding, still participated in schemes to manipulate my property, still demonstrated a fundamental lack of respect for my role in your lives." "But," Orlando prompted, "but it does provide context that suggests your actions were influenced by someone with genuinely malicious intent. You were manipulated by an expert manipulator who was planning far worse than you realized." Wade reached across the table and picked up the check they'd given him months earlier. "I never cashed this." He tore it in half. "Consider it a wedding gift. The education I provided was worth far more than $47,000. As the evening progressed, they talked about the future, their roles in the company, their living situations, the slow process of rebuilding trust. It wasn't the family reunion Wade had once imagined, but it was something perhaps more valuable, a foundation for honest relationships built on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. When they prepared to leave, Christina hugged him, the first physical contact they'd had in over a year. "Dad, I know things can't go back to the way they were. But thank you for giving us the chance to become people worth respecting. Wade watched them drive away, then returned to his study. The photograph of 7-year-old Christina was back on his desk, but now it was joined by new photos, images of the capable, responsible adults his family had become through adversity. The wedding gift that had started as revenge had ultimately become redemption. Chapter 9. The Legacy Rebuilt. 2 years later, Wade stood on the terrace of his Malibu mansion watching Christina direct the setup for a company barbecue. It wasn't a family gathering. It was a corporate event for Stewart Industries' top performers. But watching his daughter efficiently coordinate logistics while building genuine relationships with her colleagues filled him with a pride he'd never felt during her privileged years. Vicky approached from the house, carrying a platter of food. Her role as director of property operations had evolved into something resembling a chief operating officer position, and her business acumen had surprised everyone, including Wade himself. "The Hong Kong team just confirmed," she said. "They'll be video conferencing in for the presentation at 4. Wade nodded. "Orlando's logistics projections for the Asian expansion? Comprehensive and conservative. He's learned to underpromise and overdeliver." Orlando had indeed transformed dramatically. His experience with gambling addiction had given him unique insights into risk management that proved invaluable in business planning. He'd also married Christina in a simple courthouse ceremony, a genuine celebration that Wade had been honored to attend. "Sir," Marlene approached with a tablet. "The sole property acquisition just closed. Mr. Dodson's shipping projections were accurate to within 2%. Wade smiled. Orlando's insistence on being called Mr. Dodson in professional settings had been his own decision, a way of establishing credibility independent of family connections. And the quarterly numbers? Stewart Industries had the most profitable quarter in company history. The family divisions contributed significantly to that success. Wade looked around at the gathering. His employees, including his former family, were engaged, productive, and genuinely committed to excellence. This was what he'd always envisioned building, a legacy organization that created value through competence and dedication. Christina appeared at his elbow. "Dad, there's someone here to see you." Wade turned to see a familiar figure approaching. Agent Felipe Powell, now retired from the SEC. "Agent Powell, this is unexpected. Mr. Stewart, I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I was in the area and wanted to update you on Seth Riley." "Of course. What's his status?" "He was killed in federal prison 3 months ago, stabbed by another inmate during a dispute over gambling debts." Wade absorbed this information without emotion. "I see. There's something else. Before he died, Riley confessed to planning your murder. He'd hired someone to arrange what would look like an accident during one of your business trips. The plan was to collect the insurance money and disappear with your wife." Vicky, who had overheard, went pale. "Felipe, I had no idea." "We know, Mrs. Henderson." Vicky had reverted to her maiden name after the divorce. "Our investigation confirmed that Riley never shared his ultimate intentions with any of you." Agent Powell turned back to Wade. "I wanted you to know that your instincts about the danger were correct. The surveillance and security measures you implemented likely saved your life." After Powell left, Wade found himself alone on the terrace with his former family. The weight of what they'd unknowingly participated in hung heavy in the air. "Wade," Vicky said quietly, "how can you stand to be around us? Knowing that our actions brought someone into your life who wanted to kill you." Wade considered the question carefully. "Because you didn't know his true intentions. Because when you discovered the scope of his criminality, you chose to expose it rather than protect yourselves. Because you spent 2 years proving that you learned from the experience." Orlando spoke up. "But we still enabled him. We still made the choices that put you in danger." "Yes, you did. And you've paid the consequences for those choices. But holding on to anger about past mistakes prevents growth. The people you've become are more valuable than the punishment you might deserve for who you used to be." Christina joined the conversation. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you just cut us off completely. Easier for you, probably." Wade shook his head. "Easier, yes. But wasteful. You had potential that just needed to be properly developed. Destroying potential is always a mistake, even when it's justified." That evening, After the company barbecue ended and the employees had gone home, Wade sat in his study reviewing the day's events. His secure phone buzzed with a message from his head of security. Perimeter secure. All family members departed safely. Wade smiled at the terminology. Even his security team had begun referring to Christina, Vicky, and Orlando as family members again, though their relationship with Wade was now primarily professional. He opened his laptop and began typing his annual letter to the board of directors. This year's theme was legacy and leadership, building sustainable success through human development. As he wrote, Wade reflected on the unexpected journey of the past 2 years. The wedding that never happened had indeed been a gift, not just to his family, but to him as well. It had forced him to confront the difference between providing for people and developing them, between financial generosity and emotional investment. His phone rang. Christina, Dad, I wanted to thank you for hosting today. The team really appreciated seeing the Malibu property. It was my pleasure. Your presentation on the European marketing strategy was impressive. I learned from the best. A pause. Dad, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you ever regret how things turned out? The divorce, the separation, the way our relationship changed. Wade considered this. I regret the pain that was necessary to create growth, but I don't regret the growth itself. We have something now that we never had when we were a traditional family. What's that? Mutual respect, earned rather than assumed. After hanging up, Wade returned to his letter. The final paragraph read, True legacy is not measured by what we leave to our successors, but by what we teach them to build for themselves. The greatest gift we can give the next generation is not wealth, but the wisdom and capability to create their own. Wade printed the letter, then walked out onto the terrace one final time. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly before him, dark and powerful under the moonlight. Somewhere out there, ships were carrying goods managed by Orlando's logistics systems to hotels marketed by Christina's campaigns and maintained by Vicky's operational excellence. The empire he'd built was no longer just his. It was theirs as well, earned through competence rather than inheritance. The wedding gift he'd given them had ultimately become the greatest gift they'd given him, a family worth respecting. Wade Stewart had finally built the legacy he'd always envisioned, not through blood or money, but through the transformation of potential into achievement. The revenge that had begun in anger had ended in redemption. And that, Wade reflected, was the most perfect victory of all. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Mask Falls. Robert Sullivan adjusted his tie in the bathroom mirror of their modest suburban home, watching the reflection of a man who'd perfected the art of invisibility. For 15 years, he played the role of the unremarkable middle manager, the dependable but forgettable husband who brought home a steady paycheck and asked for nothing more than peace. Behind his calm gray eyes lay depths that no one in his current life had ever bothered to explore. The truth was, Robert had been many things before he became Robert Sullivan. Before he'd chosen this quiet life, he'd been someone else entirely. Someone who'd built empires and crushed enemies without breaking a sweat. But that was before he'd met Brenda at a charity gala, where he'd been using an assumed identity to lay low after a particularly brutal business acquisition. She'd been beautiful, charming, and blissfully unaware that the struggling consultant she'd fallen for could buy and sell her father's construction company 10 times over. Rob, hurry up. We're going to be late for Michael's final fitting. Brenda's voice carried an edge of impatience that had become her default tone over the past 2 years. Their son's wedding was in 3 days, and she'd been orchestrating every detail with military precision, not out of love for their boy, but because this was her moment to shine in front of the family and friends who'd always looked down on her choice of husband. Robert smiled at his reflection. Soon, very soon, the performance would end. Downstairs, Brenda was already in the car, engine running, her manicured fingers drumming against the steering wheel. At 43, she maintained her beauty through expensive treatments that she somehow always found money for, despite their supposedly tight budget. Her auburn hair was styled in soft waves that framed her face perfectly, and her designer dress, another mysterious purchase, hugged her figure in all the right places. Finally, she muttered as Robert slid into the passenger seat. "I swear, sometimes I think you move slow on purpose just to annoy me." "Sorry, dear. Just wanted to look presentable for our son's big day." Robert's voice carried the same mild, apologetic tone he'd perfected over the years. The tone of a man who'd been beaten down by life and accepted his place in the pecking order. Brenda snorted. "Presentable, right? Well, try not to embarrass us in front of the Matthews family. Craig's parents already think Michael could have done better in the father department." Craig Matthews. Even thinking the name made Robert's jaw clench slightly, though he kept his expression neutral. Craig was everything Robert pretended not to be: wealthy, confident, successful, and currently having an affair with his wife. Robert had known for 8 months now, had watched and documented every secret meeting, every stolen kiss, every lie that fell so easily from Brenda's lips. The knowledge had been a gift, in a way. It had freed him from any lingering guilt about what he was going to do. "The Matthews family seems very accomplished," Robert said carefully, watching Brenda's face for any telltale signs. The slight flush in her cheeks, the way her grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Craig is Michael's best man for a reason," she said, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "He's been a real friend to our son, helped him with connections for his job, been there when—" She trailed off, clearly having almost said too much. "When what?" Robert pressed gently. "Nothing. Just when Michael needed guidance. Male guidance." The implication hung in the air between them, that Robert had somehow failed as a father, that Craig had stepped in to fill the void. Robert nodded slowly, filing away another piece of evidence for the case he was building. Not for any court of law, but for the court of public opinion that would soon sit in judgment of them all. They arrived at the upscale bridal shop, where Michael was having his final tuxedo fitting. Their son stood before a three-way mirror, looking handsome and nervous in his black formal wear. At 25, Michael had inherited his mother's striking features and his father's subtle intelligence, though he'd never seen past the carefully constructed facade Robert maintained. "Dad!" Michael's face lit up as they entered. Despite everything, Robert felt a genuine warmth for his son. Michael was a good kid who'd simply been influenced by his mother's opinions about his father's worth. "You look great, son." Robert clapped him on the shoulder, noting how Michael had filled out since college. "Sarah's going to be speechless." "Thanks, Dad. I just hope everything goes perfectly. You know how important this is to Mom." And there it was, the casual dismissal, the assumption that this day was about Brenda's social standing rather than his son's happiness. Robert had watched this pattern develop over the years, seen how his wife had systematically undermined his relationship with her son, painting him as the weak link in their family chain. Brenda was already chatting with the seamstress about final adjustments, her voice carrying across the shop as she detailed her vision for the perfect wedding photos. She wanted everything to look flawless, wanted the world to see her as the successful mother who'd raised an accomplished son despite her disappointing husband. "Mr. Sullivan," a voice interrupted his thoughts. Craig Matthews had entered the shop, looking every inch the successful investment banker in his perfectly tailored suit. At 35, Craig was younger than Robert, but carried himself with the kind of arrogant confidence that came from never having faced real consequences. "Craig," Robert replied with a mild smile, extending his hand. "Good to see you." Craig's handshake was deliberately firm, a small power play that Robert absorbed without reaction. "Likewise. Big day coming up. I hope you're ready for all the excitement." There was something in Craig's tone, a subtle mockery that suggested he knew exactly how little Robert understood about the true nature of the excitement to come. Behind Craig's confident smile, Robert could see the man who whispered sweet lies to his wife, who made promises about the life they'd have together once she finally left her pathetic husband. "Oh, I'm ready," Robert said quietly. I've been preparing for this day longer than you might imagine." Something flickered in Craig's eyes, confusion, perhaps a hint of unease. But before he could respond, Brenda appeared at his side, her hand briefly touching his arm in a gesture that would have seemed innocent to anyone not watching for it. "Craig, thank you for coming. I wanted to make sure everything was coordinated for the bachelor party tomorrow night." "Of course," Craig replied smoothly. "I've got everything arranged. It's going to be a night to remember." Robert watched the exchange with the patience of a predator. Tomorrow night's bachelor party would indeed be memorable, though not in the way Craig was expecting. The pieces were already in motion, phone calls had been made, and certain facts about Craig's business dealings were about to come to light in very public ways. But that was just the opening move. The real game would begin at the wedding itself, when Robert finally shed his mask and showed them all who they'd really been dealing with for the past 15 years. "I should mention," Robert said casually, "I've invited a guest to the wedding, an old friend who's in town for business. I hope that's all right." Brenda's eyes narrowed slightly. "A guest? Rob, we've already given final numbers to the caterer. Who is this person?" "Just someone from my past. Victoria Sterling. She's successful in her field." The name meant nothing to them, of course. Victoria Sterling was known only in the highest circles of international business, a woman who'd built a multimedia empire from nothing and now commanded respect in boardrooms around the world. She was also someone who owed Robert a very significant favor from their shared past. "Well, I suppose one more person won't hurt," Brenda said with obvious irritation. "Though I wish you'd mentioned this sooner." Robert nodded apologetically. "Sorry, dear. It was a last-minute thing." As they left the shop, Michael walking between his parents with his garment bag, Robert allowed himself a small smile. In less than 72 hours, the carefully constructed world that Brenda and Craig inhabited would come crashing down around them. And unlike the mild-mannered man they thought they knew, Robert Sullivan never forgave and never forgot. The stage was set. Now it was time for the show to begin. Chapter 2: Shadows and Secrets. The Sterling Hotel's penthouse suite overlooked the city like a throne room, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the lights below. Victoria Sterling stood silhouetted against those windows, her platinum blonde hair catching the soft lamplight as she reviewed the documents spread across the mahogany table. At 41, she possessed the kind of timeless elegance that came from absolute confidence in her own power. "You're certain about this timeline?" she asked without turning around, her voice carrying a slight British accent that spoke of expensive schools and old money. Robert sat in one of the leather chairs, looking entirely different than he had at the tuxedo shop that afternoon. Gone was the slightly rumpled appearance, the apologetic posture, the mild expression of a man beaten down by life. In their place was someone sharp-edged and dangerous, someone who belonged in rooms where billion-dollar decisions were made with a nod. "Everything's in motion," he confirmed, his voice deeper now, carrying an authority that Brenda had never heard. "Craig's bachelor party is tomorrow night. The venue I've arranged will ensure maximum exposure when the story breaks." Victoria finally turned, her ice-blue eyes studying him with the intensity of a shark sensing blood. "You know, I could simply destroy them financially and be done with it. A few phone calls, some strategic pressure. They'd be bankrupted by noon." "Too clean," Robert replied, shaking his head. "They need to understand what they've lost. Brenda needs to see exactly how far she's fallen, and Craig needs to face the consequences of thinking he could take what belongs to me." "And your son?" Robert's expression hardened. "Michael made his choice when he sided with them against me. When he laughed at his father behind my back and called me weak. When he chose Craig as his role model over his own blood." Victoria nodded slowly, understanding the depth of betrayal that went beyond mere adultery. She'd known Robert for 20 years, had watched him build and destroy business empires with the kind of ruthless precision that made him both feared and respected in certain circles. The man who'd chosen to play house in suburbia was still the same person who'd once orchestrated the downfall of 3 Fortune 500 companies in a single quarter. "The timing of my arrival at the wedding will be crucial," she said, moving to pour herself a glass of wine from the bottle chilling on the side table. Too early, and it loses impact. Too late, and they might have already scattered. 20 minutes after the ceremony begins, Robert specified. Give them time to settle in, to feel secure. Let Brenda have her moment of triumph when she sees me walk in alone, when she gets to humiliate me in front of everyone. Then you arrive, and everything changes. Victoria smiled, a predatory expression that would have terrified anyone who didn't know her well. I do love a good entrance. Though I have to ask, are you certain about the nuclear option? Once we go public with our connection, there's no going back to your quiet, suburban life. Robert was quiet for a long moment, considering. For 15 years, he'd lived as Robert Sullivan, mild-mannered middle manager. But before that, he'd been someone else entirely. Someone who'd built a shadow empire of legitimate businesses, strategic investments, and carefully cultivated relationships. Someone who'd accumulated enough wealth and influence to disappear completely when the life he'd been living became too dangerous. Meeting Brenda had seemed like providence, a chance to be normal, to have a family, to live without constantly watching over his shoulder. He'd genuinely loved her, had seen in her the possibility of redemption from the darker aspects of his past. But love, he'd learned, was just another weakness to be exploited by those who recognized it. The quiet life was an illusion anyway, he said finally. I thought I could be someone different, but people like us, we are what we are. The only difference is whether we own it or let others use it against us. Victoria raised her glass in a toast. To owning it, then they drank. And then Victoria moved to another table where additional documents waited. Your friend Craig has been busier than even he realizes. The investment firm he works for has been hemorrhaging clients for months, but he's been covering it up with increasingly desperate measures. Nothing illegal, mind you, but certainly unethical enough to destroy his reputation when it comes to light. And the timing. The story breaks tomorrow night, right in the middle of his bachelor party. I've arranged for certain journalists to be in attendance, purely by coincidence, of course. By Saturday morning, Craig Matthews will be the face of investment fraud in the local news cycle. Robert nodded approvingly. It was elegant in its simplicity, using Craig's own poor decisions against him rather than manufacturing evidence. The man had dug his own grave. Robert was simply providing the shovel. What about Brenda's reaction when she realizes what's happening? That's where the psychological aspect becomes crucial, Victoria replied, settling into the chair across from him. She spent years building her identity around being the long-suffering wife of a failure. When that failure suddenly becomes the most powerful person in the room, it will shatter everything she believes about herself and her choices. They spent the next hour reviewing every detail of the plan, from the specific timing of revelations to the guest list management that would ensure maximum social destruction. Victoria had brought her own team of specialists, people who understood how to orchestrate public humiliation with surgical precision. There is one thing I'm curious about, Victoria said as they wrapped up. Why didn't you simply leave? Why go through all this elaborate revenge when you could have just walked away and started over somewhere else? Robert was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes distant as he considered the question. Because they took something from me that can't be replaced. Not just my wife or my son's respect. They took the belief that I could ever trust anyone enough to be vulnerable again. They turned my love into a weapon against me. And now they learn what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness. When you assume that just because someone chooses not to use their power, they don't have it. Victoria nodded, understanding the deeper truth behind his words. Revenge wasn't just about punishment. It was about restoring the natural order, about ensuring that predators understood there were bigger predators in the ecosystem. As the evening wound down, they made final arrangements for the wedding day itself. Victoria would arrive with an entourage that would make it impossible to ignore her presence or her obvious wealth. The timing would be carefully choreographed to maximize the shock value and ensure that everyone present understood exactly what they were witnessing. One last question, Victoria said as she walked him to the door. After this is over, after they've all paid the price for their betrayal, what then? What does Robert Sullivan do when there's no one left to punish? Robert paused at the threshold, considering her question. For so long, his life had been defined by the role he was playing, by the careful maintenance of his cover identity. After Saturday, that man would cease to exist, and he'd have to decide who he wanted to become. "I suppose I'll find out," he said finally. "But whatever comes next, it will be on my terms." As the elevator carried him down from the penthouse, Robert felt a familiar sense of anticipation building in his chest. It was the same feeling he'd had before every major business acquisition, every strategic move that would reshape entire industries. The feeling of pieces falling into place, of elaborate plans reaching their culmination. Tomorrow night, Craig Matthews would learn that his perfect life was built on foundations of sand. Saturday, Brenda would discover that the man she'd betrayed was someone far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. And Sunday, Robert would begin the process of deciding who he wanted to be in a world where he no longer had to pretend to be someone else. The game was almost over. Soon, it would be time for the final moves. Chapter 3. The Bachelor's Lament. The Riverside Club had been Craig's idea, an upscale venue where Cincinnati's young professionals went to see and be seen. The kind of place where a successful investment banker could celebrate his best friend's last night of freedom, surrounded by other successful men who appreciated fine whiskey and expensive cigars. Craig had spared no expense, renting out the private dining room and ensuring that only the city's most eligible bachelors would be in attendance. What he didn't know was that Robert had purchased the club 6 months ago through a shell company, and that every staff member present tonight was on his payroll. Michael Sullivan stood at the center of the celebration, looking uncomfortable in his role as guest of honor. At 25, he'd inherited his mother's social anxiety beneath her polished exterior, and being the focus of attention at events like this always left him feeling slightly fraudulent. The other men were older, more established, more confident in their success. They treated him with the kind of casual respect reserved for the promising younger brother of their circle. To Michael Sullivan, Craig raised his glass of 30-year-old scotch, his voice carrying over the conversations. "May your marriage be everything mine will be, profitable, strategic, and satisfying to all parties involved." The toast got a round of laughter from the assembled men, though Michael noticed the edge in Craig's humor. There was something different about Craig lately, a tension that seemed to simmer just beneath his usual confident facade. His success at the investment firm had made him cocky, but there were moments when Michael caught him looking almost desperate, as if he were constantly calculating something just out of reach. "Thanks, Craig," Michael replied, raising his own glass. "Though I hope Sarah and I are marrying for love, not strategy." More laughter, but this time with a slightly uncomfortable edge. These men understood marriage as a business arrangement, a merger of families and assets rather than a romantic partnership. It was a perspective that Michael's mother had been subtly encouraging for months, suggesting that Sarah's family connections could be valuable for his career advancement. "Love is for poor people," declared Harrison Webb, Craig's partner at the investment firm. "The rest of us marry for mutual benefit and find our passion elsewhere." The comment drew nods of agreement from several of the other men, and Michael felt a familiar sense of disconnection from this world that his mother was so eager for him to join. These weren't his friends. They were Craig's friends, men who tolerated him because of his connection to Craig and his potential future value to their network. Speaking of passion elsewhere, Harrison continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Craig, how's your side project coming along? The one with the older woman?" Michael looked up sharply, something cold settling in his stomach as he saw the expression that flashed across Craig's face. It was gone in an instant, replaced by Craig's usual confident smirk, but Michael had seen enough to recognize guilt when it appeared. "Gentlemen never kiss and tell," Craig replied smoothly, but his eyes were scanning the room as if looking for exits. "Come on," Harrison pressed, emboldened by alcohol and the encouragement of the other men. "We've all seen you sneaking around with her. Red hair, great body, looks like she could teach a younger man a few things." "Who is she?" Michael's blood turned to ice as the description registered. Red hair, great body, older woman. His mother fit that description perfectly, and she'd been acting strangely for months. New clothes, mysterious appointments, a general air of excitement that she tried to hide whenever his father was around. "Harrison, you're drunk," Craig said, his voice carrying a warning edge that the other man either didn't hear or chose to ignore. "Drunk, maybe, but not blind. She's married, isn't she? That's why all the secrecy. Come on, Craig, we're all friends here. What's her story?" The room had gone quiet now, sensing drama in the making. Michael found himself standing frozen, his glass halfway to his lips, as a horrible possibility began to take shape in his mind. His mother's new wardrobe, her unexplained absences, the way she looked at Craig during family gatherings, like she was sharing some private joke that excluded everyone else. "Her story," Craig said slowly, his confidence returning as he seemed to make a decision, "is that she's trapped in a marriage to a weak man who can't satisfy her needs. A man who's so pathetic that his own wife comes to me for what she can't get at home." Michael's glass slipped from his numb fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the sudden silence. Every eye in the room turned to him, and he saw the exact moment when Craig realized what he'd just revealed. "Michael," Craig started, his face going pale. "I didn't mean—" "My mother," Michael said quietly, his voice barely audible. "You're talking about my mother." The silence stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Several of the other men shifted uncomfortably, suddenly finding their drinks fascinating as they realized they'd stumbled into a family drama that was about to explode. Craig's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. "Look, Michael, it's not what you think. Your mother and I, we're just what?" Michael's voice was gaining strength now, fueled by a rage that was building from somewhere deep in his chest. "Just fucking behind my father's back? Just making him look like a fool while you celebrate how clever you are?" "Your father is a fool," Craig shot back, his own anger flaring now that his secret was out. "Your mother deserves better than a man who can't even provide for his family properly. She deserves someone who can give her the life she wants." Michael stared at him for a long moment, seeing Craig clearly for perhaps the first time. Not the successful mentor figure his mother had painted him as, but a predator who'd systematically seduced his way into their family for his own gratification. "And you think that someone is you?" Michael asked, his voice deadly quiet. "I know it is," Craig replied with returning confidence. "I can give her things your father never could. Security, excitement, a future worth having. She knows it too." The slap came so fast that Craig didn't have time to react. Michael's palm connected with his cheek with a sound like a gunshot, and Craig stumbled backward, his hand flying to his face in shock. "You son of a bitch," Michael snarled. "That's my family you're talking about." "Your family?" Craig laughed bitterly, straightening up and adjusting his tie. "Your father's a joke, Michael. He works a dead-end job and lives in a house he can barely afford. Your mother settled for him because she didn't know better, but now she does. And deep down, you know I'm right." The words hit Michael like physical blows because part of him didn't know Craig was right, at least about his father's apparent failures. He'd grown up watching his mother's frustration with her modest lifestyle, listening to her complaints about his father's lack of ambition, absorbing the subtle message that Robert Sullivan was somehow less than other men. But hearing it stated so baldly, seeing the smug satisfaction on Craig's face as he destroyed his family's foundation, Michael felt something snap inside him. "Get out," he said quietly. "Michael, be reasonable. Get out," Michael roared, his voice carrying through the private dining room and into the main club beyond. "Get out before I do something we'll both regret." Craig looked around the room at the other men, clearly expecting support, but found only uncomfortable stares and sudden fascination with shoes and drink glasses. The revelation had crossed a line that even these morally flexible men weren't willing to cross. Betraying a friend's family was one thing, but bragging about it was another entirely. "Fine," Craig said, straightening his jacket and trying to regain his composure. "But this doesn't change anything, Michael. Your mother made her choice. She chose me." "Then she chose poorly," Michael replied, his voice now ice cold. "And so did you." Craig left without another word, and the bachelor party died with his departure. The other men made awkward excuses and filtered out over the next 20 minutes, leaving Michael alone with his shattered illusions and a growing sense of dread about what this meant for his wedding in 2 days. But as he sat in the empty dining room, surrounded by the detritus of what should have been a celebration, Michael began to think about his father differently. Not as the weak failure his mother had painted him as, but as a man who'd been systematically betrayed by the people he'd trusted most. For the first time in years, Michael felt a surge of protective anger for Robert Sullivan. And for the first time in his life, he began to wonder if there was more to his father than anyone had bothered to discover. The bachelor party was over. But the real celebration Michael was beginning to suspect hadn't even started yet. Chapter 4. The wedding begins. Saturday morning dawned gray and overcast, with threatening clouds that perfectly matched the tension simmering beneath the surface of what should have been the happiest day of Michael Sullivan's life. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock at St. Margaret Cathedral, followed by a reception at the exclusive Riverside Country Club, the same venue where Craig's bachelor party had imploded less than 18 hours earlier. Brenda Sullivan stood before her bedroom mirror, applying the final touches to her makeup with hands that trembled slightly from nerves and anticipation. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, a sophisticated navy blue dress that hugged her figure perfectly, paired with pearls that had cost more than her husband's monthly salary. Today was her day to shine, her moment to show their social circle that she'd raised a successful son despite her disappointing marriage. The irony wasn't lost on her that while she prepared to celebrate her son's wedding, she was already mentally planning her own divorce. Craig had promised her a different life, one filled with the luxury and respect she deserved. After today's public debut as a successful mother, she would finally have the courage to leave Robert and start over with a man who could give her everything she'd always wanted. Her phone buzzed with a text from Craig. Had to leave town on business emergency. We'll try to make it back for reception. Tell Michael I'm sorry about last night. Brenda frowned, a cold knot forming in her stomach. Craig leaving town on their son's wedding day? After what had happened at the bachelor party, she'd heard about the confrontation from Michael, who'd returned home white-faced and refused to explain exactly what had been said. But Craig had assured her it was just a misunderstanding, that Michael was overreacting to some harmless bachelor party humor. Now Craig was gone, and she was left to face the wedding day alone with a husband who'd been acting strangely all week and a son who could barely look her in the eye. Downstairs, Robert was in the kitchen making coffee with the methodical precision of a man preparing for battle. He'd slept poorly, not from nerves, but from the adrenaline that came with knowing that everything he'd carefully planned was about to come to fruition. In a few hours, the careful facade he'd maintained for 15 years would finally fall away, and everyone would see exactly who they'd been dealing with. Michael appeared in the doorway, looking haggard and conflicted in his white dress shirt and black pants. The young man who'd always been quick with a smile looked like he'd aged years overnight. "Dad," Michael said quietly, "can we talk?" Robert looked up from his coffee, noting the uncertainty in his son's voice. This wasn't the confident young man who'd been dismissive of his father's opinions and eager to follow Craig's example. This was someone who'd had his worldview shattered and was struggling to rebuild it. "Of course, son. What's on your mind?" Michael sat down at the kitchen table, running his hands through his hair in a gesture that reminded Robert painfully of his own nervous habits. "Last night at the bachelor party, Craig said some things. About Mom. About you." Robert kept his expression neutral, though internally he was pleased that Craig's arrogance had finally gotten the better of him. He'd expected the man to be more careful, but desperation and alcohol had a way of loosening tongues. "What kind of things?" He said he was having an affair with Mom. Said you were weak and that she deserved better. Michael's voice cracked slightly on the words. "Dad, please tell me he was lying." Robert set down his coffee cup carefully, studying his son's face. Here was the moment he'd been waiting for, the chance to tell Michael the truth about what kind of man his father really was. But looking at the pain in his son's eyes, Robert felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness. "I've known about your mother and Craig for 8 months, Robert said quietly. "I've been watching, documenting, waiting for the right moment to act." Michael's face went white. "You've known? For 8 months? Why didn't you stop it?" "Because I needed to understand the full scope of the betrayal," Robert replied, his voice taking on an edge that Michael had never heard before. I needed to know exactly who I was dealing with and how far they were willing to go. But Dad, if you knew, why didn't you fight for her? Why didn't you try to win her back? Robert studied his son carefully, seeing the young man's fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. Michael still thought this was about love, about marriage, about fighting for someone who could be saved. Michael, Robert said gently, you don't fight for someone who's already chosen to be your enemy. You don't try to win back someone who never valued what they had in the first place. Something in Robert's tone made Michael look at his father more closely. There was a hardness there, a cold certainty that seemed completely at odds with the mild-mannered man he'd grown up with. What are you going to do? Robert smiled, and for the first time, Michael saw something dangerous in his father's expression. I'm going to make sure that everyone understands exactly what they've lost and what the consequences are for betraying someone who trusted them. Before Michael could respond, Brenda's voice called down from upstairs. Rob, Michael, we need to leave in 20 minutes. Robert stood up, straightening his tie with the same careful precision he'd used to plan every detail of what was about to unfold. Son, I want you to remember something today. Watch carefully, and you'll learn the difference between being weak and choosing to be patient. Michael stared at his father, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in his life. This wasn't the defeated man his mother had always described. This was someone who'd been waiting, planning, preparing for exactly this moment. Dad, what aren't you telling me? Robert paused at the kitchen doorway, looking back at his son with something that might have been regret. After today, you'll know everything. And then you'll have to decide who you want to be, someone who stands with family or someone who chooses sides based on convenience. As Robert left the kitchen, Michael sat alone with his growing sense that his wedding day was about to become something far more complicated than a simple celebration. Everything he believed about his family, about his future, about the kind of man his father was, had been turned upside down in the space of 24 hours. Upstairs, he could hear his parents moving around, preparing for the ceremony that would unite him with Sarah in marriage. But Michael was beginning to suspect that before this day was over, other unions would be permanently severed, and other truths would be revealed that would change everything he thought he knew about the people he loved. The gray clouds outside were growing darker, and Michael couldn't shake the feeling that a storm was coming that would reshape his entire world. As the Sullivan family prepared to leave for the cathedral, none of them were quite the same people they'd been when they'd woken up that morning. The masks were beginning to slip, and the carefully maintained fiction of their happy suburban life was about to collide with the brutal reality of betrayal, revenge, and the true cost of underestimating a patient man's capacity for retribution. The wedding was about to begin, but the real ceremony, the one that would determine who stood where when the dust settled, was still to come. Chapter 5, The Arrival. St. Margaret's Cathedral was a testament to old-world grandeur, its Gothic spires reaching toward the threatening sky like stone prayers. The afternoon light filtered through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the assembled guests who filled the oak pews with the quiet murmur of social anticipation. This was Cincinnati's social event of the season, the wedding of Michael Sullivan to Sarah Hartwell, uniting two families with deep roots in the community's establishment. Robert Sullivan walked down the center aisle alone, his modest gray suit marking him as distinctly out of place among the designer clothing and expensive jewelry that adorned the other guests. Whispers followed in his wake, not of respect or recognition, but of barely concealed pity and social awkwardness. Here was the father of the groom, the man who couldn't even afford a proper tuxedo for his own son's wedding. Brenda had arrived earlier with the wedding party, leaving Robert to make his solitary entrance as she'd planned. She wanted everyone to see the stark contrast between her successful son and her disappointing husband, to understand that whatever Michael had accomplished, it was despite his father rather than because of him. Robert took his assigned seat in the front row, noting the careful way other guests avoided making eye contact with him. To them, he was an embarrassment, the weak link in what should have been a perfect family portrait. He could feel their judgment, their whispered speculation about how someone like Michael had emerged from such unpromising genetic material. Behind him, He heard the familiar voice of Margaret Hartwell, Sarah's mother, speaking in a stage whisper designed to be overheard. "I still can't believe Brenda married that man. Look at him. He can't even manage to look successful at his own son's wedding." Her companion's response was equally audible. "Well, at least Michael takes after his mother. Thank goodness for that. Though I heard even she's finally come to her senses about the marriage." Robert smiled slightly, allowing their casual cruelty to wash over him like background noise. These people had no idea what they were about to witness. No conception that the unremarkable man they were dismissing would soon demonstrate exactly how little their opinions mattered. The ceremony proceeded with traditional elegance. Michael stood at the altar looking handsome but troubled, while Sarah glowed with bridal radiance beside him. Father Morrison's voice carried through the cathedral as he spoke about the sanctity of marriage, about commitment and faithfulness, about the bonds that should never be broken between those who love each other. The irony wasn't lost on Robert as he watched his son pledge eternal fidelity while his wife sat in the second row, checking her phone for messages from her lover who had mysteriously disappeared the night before. As the ceremony reached its midpoint, Robert checked his watch. 12 minutes past 2. In exactly 8 minutes, Victoria Sterling would make her entrance, and everything would change. But first, Robert had his own performance to give. During a pause in the service, he stood up slowly, his movement causing a ripple of attention through the assembled guests. Heads turned, eyebrows raised, as the father of the groom appeared to be preparing to speak without invitation. "Excuse me," Robert said, his voice carrying clearly through the cathedral despite its moderate volume. "Father Morrison, if I may." The priest looked uncomfortable but nodded, clearly unsure how to handle this breach of protocol. Brenda's face had gone white with mortification, while Michael looked on with growing alarm. "I just wanted to say something about marriage," Robert continued, his tone conversational but somehow commanding attention. "About what it means to promise your life to someone, to trust them with your deepest vulnerabilities, to believe that they'll stand by you no matter what." The cathedral was dead silent now. Every guest focused on this unexpected interruption from the man they'd all been dismissing as irrelevant. "My son is making those promises today," Robert said, his eyes finding Michael at the altar. "And I hope he chooses more carefully than some of us have." Brenda half rose from her seat, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Rob, please, this isn't the time." "Isn't it?" Robert asked, turning to look at her directly. "When is the right time to talk about faithfulness, Brenda? When is the appropriate moment to discuss what happens when people break their most sacred vows?" The murmur that ran through the cathedral was electric with tension and anticipation. This wasn't the gentle, defeated man they all expected. This was someone else entirely, someone who commanded attention through sheer force of presence. "Perhaps," Robert continued, "we should talk about what it means when a wife chooses to share her bed with her son's best friend. When she makes a mockery of her marriage vows while planning to abandon her family for a man who promises her a better life." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the children in the congregation seemed to sense that something momentous was happening, something that would be remembered and whispered about for years to come. Brenda's face had gone from white to bright red. "How dare you? How dare I what?" Robert asked, his voice still calm, but now carrying an undertone of steel that silenced her immediately. "How dare I tell the truth? How dare I refuse to pretend anymore that we're one big, happy family?" He turned back to the assembled guests, noting their rapt attention, their shock at seeing the church mouse reveal himself to be something far more dangerous. "You all think you know me," Robert said, his voice carrying to every corner of the cathedral. "You think I'm weak, unsuccessful, unworthy of the family I somehow lucked into. You've spent years pitying me, dismissing me, treating me like a failure because I drive a modest car and work a regular job." The guests were transfixed now, unable to look away from this unexpected transformation. "But here's something you might find interesting," Robert continued, checking his watch again. "Sometimes people choose to appear weak because it serves their purposes. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. At exactly 20 minutes past 2, the cathedral's main doors opened with a sound that echoed through the vaulted space like thunder. Every head turned to see a woman enter with the kind of presence that commanded immediate attention. Victoria Sterling, dressed in an elegant black dress that probably cost more than most people's cars, her platinum blonde hair styled to perfection, her blue eyes scanning the assembly with the cool assessment of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. Behind her came an entourage that spoke of serious wealth and power, assistants, security personnel, and a level of sophistication that made the cathedral's previous grandeur seem provincial by comparison. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert said, his voice now carrying complete authority, "I'd like you to meet my wife, Victoria Sterling." The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of dropping programs hitting the floor seemed thunderous. Brenda's mouth fell open in shock, while whispers erupted throughout the congregation as people tried to process what they were seeing. Victoria Sterling, the Victoria Sterling, whose business empire was featured on magazine covers, whose wealth was measured in billions rather than millions, whose name was synonymous with power and success on a global scale, walked down the aisle toward Robert Sullivan with the confident stride of someone who owned every space she entered. "Darling," she said as she reached him, her British accent carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "I'm so sorry I'm late. Business ran longer than expected." She kissed Robert's cheek with the familiarity of long intimacy, then turned to survey the assembled guests with the kind of smile that suggested she found their shock amusing. "I hope I haven't missed anything important," Victoria said, her eyes finding Brenda's horrified face. "Though from the looks of things, the real ceremony is just getting started." The cathedral erupted in whispers, gasps, and the sound of people frantically checking their phones to confirm what they were seeing. Victoria Sterling, one of the most powerful women in the world, was claiming to be married to the man they'd all written off as a failure. But Robert wasn't finished yet. The game was just beginning, and the final revelation that would destroy Craig Matthews and expose the full scope of the deception was still to come. As Victoria took her place beside him, Robert smiled at the sea of shocked faces and prepared to deliver the blow that would end his old life forever and begin something entirely new. Chapter 6. The Unraveling. The transformation in the cathedral was immediate and absolute. Where moments before Robert Sullivan had been the object of pity and dismissal, he now stood as the center of everyone's desperate attention. Phones appeared throughout the congregation as guests frantically searched for confirmation of what they were witnessing, finding photo after photo of Victoria Sterling at high-level business conferences, charity galas, and international summits. Always alone, always identified as one of the world's most powerful unmarried women. "Until now. I can see you're all surprised," Robert said, his voice carrying the easy confidence of someone who'd finally dropped a mask he'd grown tired of wearing. "I suppose I should explain." Brenda had sunk back into her pew, her face a mask of confusion and growing horror as the implications began to register. If Robert was married to Victoria Sterling, then everything about her understanding of her own life had just been revealed as a lie. 15 years ago, Robert continued, "I made a decision to step back from my previous life. I'd been living in a world where success was measured by how completely you could destroy your competitors, where personal relationships were just another form of strategic alliance. I was tired of that existence, tired of being someone who solved problems through intimidation and financial warfare." Victoria smiled beside him, her presence lending credibility to every word he spoke. The guests hung on his every syllable, their previous dismissal replaced by rapt attention. "So I created Robert Sullivan," he said, "a simple man with a simple job, someone who could live quietly and perhaps find something real in the process. I met Brenda at a charity gala, one where I was using my cover identity to lay low after a particularly intense business acquisition. She was beautiful, charming, and completely unaware of who I really was." "That's impossible," Brenda whispered, though her voice carried clearly in the cathedral's acoustics. "You can't be. We've been married for 15 years. I would have known." Robert turned to look at her directly, and for the first time, she saw the truth in his eyes. not the mild disappointment of a beaten-down husband, but the calculating coldness of someone who'd been playing a role for longer than she could comprehend. "You knew exactly what you wanted to know," Robert replied. "You knew I brought home a steady paycheck, that I didn't interfere with your social climbing, that I was convenient to have around when you needed a husband for appearances. You never bothered to ask deeper questions because you weren't interested in deeper answers." Victoria stepped forward slightly, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to commanding boardrooms full of powerful men. "What my husband is trying to say, rather more diplomatically than I would, is that you all chose to see what you expected to see. A successful woman like myself doesn't simply disappear from public view without careful planning and complete trust in her partner's ability to maintain necessary discretions." The pieces were falling into place for some of the quicker minds in the congregation. If Robert Sullivan was really married to Victoria Sterling, then his modest lifestyle hadn't been the result of failure. It had been a carefully maintained cover story that had fooled everyone, including his legal wife. "But the marriage license," Brenda said weakly. "Our wedding, our life together, was perfectly legal but ultimately meaningless," Robert replied without emotion. "I needed a cover identity that would stand up to scrutiny, and you needed a husband who wouldn't interfere with your plans. It worked well for everyone until you decided that wasn't enough." Father Morrison, who had been standing frozen throughout this exchange, finally found his voice. "Mr. Sullivan, if you're already married, then this ceremony is invalid." "Yes," Robert confirmed. "Though I suspect my son is beginning to understand that this day was never really about his wedding anyway." All eyes turned to Michael, who stood at the altar looking like a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. Sarah clung to his arm, her own face pale with the realization that her perfect wedding had just become the center of a scandal that would be talked about for generations. "Dad," Michael said, his voice barely audible. "What are you doing?" "I'm showing you what happens when people mistake patience for weakness," Robert replied. "I'm demonstrating the consequences of betraying someone who trusted you enough to be vulnerable." Victoria checked her phone with the casual gesture of someone accustomed to managing multiple crises simultaneously. "Speaking of consequences," she said, "I'm afraid Mr. Matthews' situation has taken a rather dramatic turn for the worse." She showed her phone screen to the congregation, displaying a news headline that was already spreading across social media. "Investment banker Craig Matthews arrested in federal fraud investigation. Clients left destitute as Ponzi scheme collapses." The photograph accompanying the article showed Craig in handcuffs being led from his office building, his face a mask of shock and defeat. "It seems," Victoria continued, "that Mr. Matthews' investment strategies were rather more creative than his clients realized. The FBI has been building a case for months, and last night's revelations provided the final piece of evidence they needed." Brenda's face went white as the full scope of her situation became clear. Craig wasn't just gone. He was destroyed, facing federal charges that would likely result in decades in prison. The man she betrayed her marriage for, the future she'd planned to escape to, had just evaporated like smoke. "You did this," she whispered, staring at Robert with growing horror. "You orchestrated all of this." "I simply provided certain information to the appropriate authorities," Robert replied calmly. "Information about investment strategies that were based on deception rather than legitimate business practices. The consequences of those strategies were always going to catch up with him eventually. I just ensured that it happened on a timeline that served my purposes." The congregation was in chaos now, guests frantically calling friends and family to share what they were witnessing. Social media feeds exploded with photos and videos of Victoria Sterling at a suburban wedding, of the mysterious transformation of Robert Sullivan, of the destruction of Craig Matthews' carefully constructed life. "But why?" Michael asked, his voice breaking. "Why destroy everything? Why not just leave if you were so unhappy?" Robert looked at his son with something that might have been sadness. "Because leaving would have meant letting them win. It would have meant allowing your mother and Craig to believe that they were smarter, more deserving, more successful than the man they betrayed. And it would have meant never giving you the chance to understand what real strength looks like." Victoria placed a gentle hand on Robert's arm, a gesture that somehow conveyed both support and warning. They had achieved their primary objective, the complete destruction of their enemies' lives and reputations. But there was still the question of what came next, of whether there was any possibility of redemption for the relationships that had been sacrificed in the pursuit of revenge. "Michael," Robert said, his voice softening slightly, "you have a choice to make now. You can continue to believe that success is measured by appearances, that strength means dominating others, that family loyalty is conditional on convenience. Or you can choose to build something real with Sarah, something based on truth rather than deception." The young man stood frozen at the altar, caught between his old understanding of the world and the new reality his father had just revealed. Everything he believed about strength and weakness, about success and failure, about the nature of his own family, had been turned upside down in the space of 20 minutes. The wedding that was supposed to unite two families had instead exposed the rod at the heart of one of them. But whether that exposure would lead to healing or to further destruction remained to be seen. As the chaos in the cathedral reached its peak, Robert Sullivan, or whoever he really was, prepared to make his final move in a game that had taken 15 years to play. The old Robert Sullivan was dead, and from his ashes, something far more dangerous was about to be born. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. The Riverside Country Club's grand ballroom had been transformed into a monument to social catastrophe. What should have been a celebration of love and new beginnings had instead become the epicenter of the most spectacular social destruction anyone in Cincinnati had ever witnessed. The reception had proceeded despite the chaos at the cathedral, though the atmosphere was electric with tension and whispered speculation. Guests clustered in small groups, phones pressed to their ears as they called friends and family to share details of what they'd witnessed. The story was already spreading beyond the local social circle, picked up by regional news outlets, and beginning to trend on social media. Victoria Sterling's presence had guaranteed national attention. The mysterious marriage of one of the world's most powerful women was exactly the kind of story that captured public imagination. Michael and Sarah sat at the head table looking shell-shocked, their wedding reception transformed into something between a wake and a circus. They'd gone through the motions of the traditional events, the first dance, the cake cutting, the toasts, but everything felt hollow and surreal, as if they were actors in a play no one had bothered to explain to them. Robert stood near the bar, accepting congratulations and questions from guests who had completely reversed their opinions of him in the span of a few hours. Men who had dismissed him as irrelevant now hung on his every word, hoping to establish some connection that might prove valuable. Women who had pitted Brenda for her unfortunate marriage now eyed Robert with calculating interest, wondering what other secrets he might be harboring. But Robert's attention was focused on his wife, who sat alone at a corner table, looking like a woman watching her entire world crumble in real time. Brenda had aged a decade in the past 4 hours, her carefully maintained facade cracking under the weight of public humiliation and the realization that everything she believed about her life had been a lie. Victoria approached the table where Brenda sat, her presence causing nearby conversations to quiet as people strained to overhear what the billionaire might say to the woman who had unknowingly stolen her husband. "Mrs. Sullivan," Victoria said, her voice carrying the crisp politeness of someone discussing an unpleasant but necessary business transaction. "I thought we should have a conversation." Brenda looked up with red-rimmed eyes, her face a mask of defeat and growing desperation. "What more could you possibly want from me? Haven't you done enough?" Victoria sat down across from her, noting the way other guests shifted position to better eavesdrop on their conversation. She was accustomed to being the center of attention, but she understood that this particular audience was witness to something more personal than her usual business dealings. "I want you to understand something," Victoria said quietly. "What happened today wasn't about punishing you for falling out of love with your husband. It wasn't even about the affair itself." "Then what was it about?" Brenda asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was about the fundamental disrespect you showed for someone who trusted you enough to be vulnerable," Victoria replied. "Robert gave up everything he was to become the man he thought you wanted. He buried his real self so completely that even I sometimes forgot who he used to be." Victoria paused, studying Brenda's face with the clinical interest of someone dissecting a business problem. But instead of appreciating that sacrifice, you treated him like a failure. You mocked him to your friends, undermined him with your son, and ultimately betrayed him with someone who saw him as nothing more than a pathetic obstacle to overcome. I didn't know, Brenda said weakly. How was I supposed to know who he really was if he never told me? Because you never bothered to ask? Victoria replied with cutting precision. In 15 years of marriage, you never once wondered why a man with Robert's intelligence and strategic thinking ability was content with a modest lifestyle. You never questioned how someone supposedly unsuccessful could be so confident in crisis, so unimpressed by the wealthy men you were so eager to social climb around. The truth of Victoria's words hit Brenda like physical blows. She had never bothered to look beneath the surface, had never wondered about the disconnect between Robert's apparent limitations and his actual capabilities. She'd seen what she expected to see and never questioned whether her expectations might be wrong. What happens now? Brenda asked, and Victoria could hear the desperation in her voice, the realization that her affair partner was facing federal prison time, that her reputation was destroyed, that her comfortable life was evaporating before her eyes. Now you learn what it means to face the consequences of your choices, Victoria said, standing up from the table. Robert has been more than generous in his arrangements for you. The house will be yours, along with enough money to maintain a modest lifestyle. But your days of luxury, of social climbing, of treating other people as disposable, those days are over. As Victoria walked away, Brenda sat alone with the wreckage of her life spreading around her like debris from an explosion. The guests who had once treated her with social respect now looked at her with a mixture of pity and fascination, like observers at a traffic accident who couldn't look away from the carnage. Across the ballroom, Michael finally approached his father, his face a mixture of anger, confusion, and reluctant admiration. I need to know something, Michael said without preamble. When you were playing this role, when you were pretending to be someone else, was any of it real? Did you ever actually love us, or were we just part of your cover story? Robert looked at his son carefully, seeing the pain beneath the anger, understanding that his answer would determine whether there was any possibility of salvaging their relationship. Everything about my love for you was real, Robert said quietly. The role I played, the life I lived, the sacrifices I made, they were all authentic expressions of how much I wanted to be the father you deserved. But you lied to me, Michael said. For my entire life, you've been lying about who you are. I simplified who I was, Robert corrected. I chose to emphasize certain aspects of my personality and suppress others. The man who taught you to ride a bike, who helped you with homework, who sat up with you when you were sick, that was the real me. It just wasn't the complete me. Michael struggled with this distinction, understanding intellectually that his father had made sacrifices but emotionally reeling from the deception. And Mom? Did you ever really love her? Robert was quiet for a long moment, considering how to answer truthfully without destroying his son's last illusions about his family. I loved who I thought she was, he said finally. I loved the woman who seemed to value kindness over status, who appeared to want a genuine partnership rather than a social accessory. But that woman, I now realize, was as much of a performance as the man I pretended to be. So what happens to us? Michael asked. To our family? Robert looked across the ballroom at Sarah, who was watching their conversation with obvious concern for her new husband's emotional state. You build something real, Robert said. You learn from the mistakes your mother and I made. You choose honesty over convenience, authenticity over appearance, loyalty over opportunity. Michael followed his father's gaze to his wife, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time that day. Not as a social prize or a career asset, but as a person who deserved better than to be married to someone carrying the toxic patterns he'd inherited from his parents' dysfunctional relationship. Will I see you again? Michael asked. Or are you disappearing back into whatever world you came from? Robert smiled, and for the first time that day, Michael saw something genuine and unguarded in his father's expression. I'm not going anywhere, but the next time we meet, it will be as equals. Two men who understand that real strength comes from choosing to be vulnerable with the right people, not from dominating those who trust you. As father and son stood together in the ruins of what had once been their family, surrounded by the debris of shattered illusions and destroyed reputations, something new began to take shape between them. Not the relationship of disappointed son and failed father, but something more honest and potentially more valuable. The old Robert Sullivan was dead, killed by his own hand in front of 300 witnesses. But from his ashes, something more authentic was beginning to emerge, something that might, with time and effort, prove worthy of the trust he'd lost and the love he'd never stopped wanting to deserve. The game was almost over. Now came the harder work of learning how to live without masks, without deception, without the comfortable lies that had sustained them all for far too long. Chapter 8. Aftermath. 3 months after the wedding that had become Cincinnati's most talked-about social event, the aftermath continued to ripple through the community like aftershocks from an earthquake. The story had grown beyond local gossip into a case study discussed in business schools and psychology programs. A perfect example of how completely people could misread those around them when they relied on assumptions rather than observation. Craig Matthews' trial had begun the previous week, with federal prosecutors painting a picture of systematic fraud that had cost his clients over $40 million. The man who had once been the golden boy of Cincinnati's investment community now sat in a defendant's chair, his future measured in decades of federal prison time. The last of his appeals had been exhausted, and his attorney had begun discussing plea bargain arrangements that might reduce his sentence from life-destroying to merely career-ending. Brenda Sullivan, she had kept the name despite the annulment of her marriage, lived quietly in the modest house that Robert had allowed her to keep. The divorce settlement had been surprisingly generous, providing her with enough money to maintain a comfortable but unremarkable lifestyle. The woman who had once dreamed of luxury and social prominence now shopped at discount stores and avoided the country club events where she'd once reigned as a minor queen. She'd aged dramatically in the months since the wedding, her hair showing gray roots that she could no longer afford to have professionally maintained, her wardrobe reduced to simple clothes bought off the rack rather than custom-tailored pieces. But perhaps more significantly, she'd begun to display a kind of quiet humility that was entirely new to her character. The humility of someone who had learned the hard way that her understanding of the world had been fundamentally flawed. The phone calls from old friends had stopped after the first month. The invitations to social events had dried up even faster. Brenda had become a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened when people confused appearance with reality, when they betrayed those who trusted them most. But solitude had given her time to think, to examine her choices and motivations with a clarity that had been impossible when she was focused on maintaining her social position. For the first time in years, she was beginning to understand the difference between being loved and being tolerated, between genuine respect and social convenience. Michael and Sarah had moved to Portland, where Michael had found work with a technology startup that valued innovation over connections. The distance from Cincinnati had been necessary, both for their own emotional healing and to escape the constant reminders of the scandal that had defined their wedding day. Their marriage was stronger for having survived the chaos, though it had required brutal honesty about their motivations and expectations. Sarah had been forced to confront her own tendency towards social climbing, while Michael had to examine the ways he'd absorbed his mother's values without questioning them. They spoke to Robert regularly, video calls where he appeared relaxed and genuinely happy in ways Michael had never seen during his childhood. The man who had once seemed burdened by his ordinary life now carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who no longer had to pretend to be anyone other than himself. Victoria Sterling had returned to her public life with characteristic efficiency, though now she was photographed with Robert at high-profile events where his presence generated significant speculation about their relationship history. Business magazines ran articles analyzing their partnership, trying to understand how such a powerful woman had managed to maintain a secret marriage for over a decade. But for all the public attention, Robert seemed more interested in private redemption than public vindication. He'd established a foundation that provided financial assistance to families destroyed by investment fraud, a direct response to the damage Craig's schemes had caused to innocent victims. The work gave him a sense of purpose that had been missing during his years of suburban anonymity. On a gray October afternoon, Brenda sat in the kitchen of her modest house, staring at a letter that had arrived that morning. Robert's handwriting was unmistakable, though she hadn't seen it in months. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope, unsure what to expect from the man whose life she'd helped destroy and who had returned the favor with devastating precision. "Brenda," the letter began, "I've been thinking about forgiveness lately. Not the kind of forgiveness that excuses behavior or pretends that betrayal doesn't matter, but the kind that allows people to move forward without being forever defined by their worst moments." She paused in her reading, surprised by the tone. She'd expected anger, gloating, perhaps a final twist of the knife that had already cut so deeply. Instead, she found something that sounded almost like compassion. "I want you to know that I understand how easy it was to underestimate me," the letter continued. "I spent 15 years deliberately making myself appear weak and unsuccessful. I gave you every reason to believe that you'd marry beneath your potential, that you deserve something better than what I seemed to offer." Brenda felt tears beginning to form as she read words that offered understanding rather than condemnation. "But I also want you to understand something else. The man you betrayed wasn't just the unsuccessful middle manager you saw on the surface. You betrayed someone who loved you enough to give up everything he was to become what he thought you needed. You betrayed someone who trusted you with vulnerabilities that could have destroyed him if you'd chosen to use them against him." The tears were flowing freely now as Brenda confronted the full weight of what she'd lost. Not just a comfortable life she'd taken for granted, but the genuine love of someone who had been willing to sacrifice his very identity for her happiness. "I'm not writing this to punish you further," the letter concluded. "You've paid the price for your choices, and continuing to hold on to anger would only poison whatever future either of us might have. I'm writing to tell you that while I can't forgive the betrayal, I can understand the woman who made those choices. And I hope that understanding that might help you forgive yourself enough to build something authentic with whatever time you have left." The letter was signed simply Robert, with no indication of his current name or status, no reminder of the power he'd reclaimed or the life he'd returned to. Just the signature of a man who had chosen to be generous in victory rather than cruel. Brenda sat in her quiet kitchen for a long time after reading the letter, mourning not just the marriage she'd destroyed, but the person she'd been when she destroyed it. The woman who had been so focused on social status that she'd missed the extraordinary man living in her own house. The woman who had been so convinced of her own superiority that she'd never bothered to look beneath the surface of the life she'd been given. But perhaps, she thought as she carefully folded the letter and placed it in the drawer where she kept her most important documents, it wasn't too late to become someone different. Someone who valued substance over appearance, authenticity over status, genuine connection over social convenience. The woman who had once dreamed of escaping her ordinary life was beginning to understand that ordinary lives, lived with integrity and genuine love, might be the most extraordinary thing of all. The reckoning was complete. Now came the harder work of learning how to live with the consequences, how to build something real from the ashes of what had been destroyed, and how to find meaning in a world where all the comfortable illusions had been stripped away. For all of them, the game was finally over. The real work of living could finally begin. Chapter 9, New Beginnings. 2 years after the wedding that had redefined what it meant to underestimate someone, Robert stood on the terrace of his Manhattan penthouse, watching the sun set over Central Park. The city spread out below him like a vast circuit board, each light representing lives and stories and dreams that continued despite the drama that had once consumed his own world. Victoria emerged from their study, carrying 2 glasses of wine and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had just concluded a particularly profitable business negotiation. Their marriage, their real marriage, conducted in a private ceremony attended only by a handful of close friends, had settled into the kind of comfortable partnership that came from mutual respect and shared understanding of what it meant to wield power responsibly. "The Portland project is approved," she announced, settling into the chair beside him. Michael's company will get the funding they need to expand into sustainable technology development. Robert smiled, pleased that his son's new venture would succeed on its own merits rather than family connections. Michael had proven himself capable of building something genuine and valuable, free from the toxic influence of social climbing and status obsession that had defined his mother's approach to life. "How's Sarah handling the pregnancy?" Victoria asked, noting the email notification on Robert's phone. "Better than Michael is handling the pregnancy," Robert replied with genuine amusement. He called 3 times yesterday, asking about cribs and car seats, and whether they should move to a different neighborhood with better schools. The prospect of becoming a grandfather filled Robert with an unexpected sense of completion. This child would grow up knowing who he really was, would never have to discover that his family had been built on lies and performance. It would be a chance to start over, to build relationships based on truth rather than carefully maintained fiction. A soft chime indicated an incoming video call, and Robert's tablet screen lit up with Michael and Sarah's faces. Sarah was visibly pregnant now, glowing with the health and happiness of someone who had found her place in the world. "Hey, Dad," Michael said, his use of the title carrying a warmth that had been missing for years. "We wanted to tell you the news in person. Well, as close to in person as we can manage." "The ultrasound showed it's a girl," Sarah added, her excitement bubbling over. "We've been talking about names, and we were wondering—" "We'd like to name her Victoria," Michael said, glancing at the woman beside his father. "If that's okay with you, Victoria. We thought it would be nice to honor the woman who helped Dad find his way back to himself." Victoria's composure cracked slightly, revealing genuine emotion beneath her usual controlled exterior. I would be honored," she said quietly. After the call ended, Robert and Victoria sat in comfortable silence, watching the city lights strengthen as darkness fell. So much had changed since that chaotic wedding day when he'd finally shed the mask he'd worn for 15 years. The suburban life that had once felt like a prison had given way to something more authentic and ultimately more satisfying. "Any regrets?" Victoria asked, noting the contemplative expression on his face. Robert considered the question carefully. The easy answer would be to say he regretted nothing, that everything had worked out exactly as he'd planned. But the truth was more complicated than that. "I regret that it took me so long to understand that love without honesty isn't really love at all," he said finally. "I regret that I thought I could build something real on a foundation of deception, even if the deception was well-intentioned." "And Brenda?" Robert was quiet for a moment, thinking about the reports he received about his former wife's new life. She'd started volunteering at a women's shelter, helping other women rebuild their lives after leaving abusive relationships. The work seemed to have given her a sense of purpose that had been missing during her years of social climbing. "I regret that she never got the chance to know who I really was," he said. "I think she might have been different if I'd trusted her with the truth from the beginning." Victoria nodded, understanding the complexity of his feelings. Revenge had been satisfying in the moment, but the deeper satisfaction came from the authentic relationships he'd built in its aftermath. An envelope lay on the side table, delivered earlier that day by private courier. Robert had been avoiding opening it, knowing it contained the final legal documents that would close the last chapter of his old life. Craig Matthews' sentencing had been completed the previous week, 23 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 15. The letter inside was handwritten, clearly composed with great care. "Mr. Sullivan, I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, and I'm not writing to request it. I'm writing to acknowledge what I now understand about the magnitude of my actions and their consequences." Robert read the letter with growing surprise. It wasn't the bitter recrimination he'd expected, nor the desperate plea for mercy that might have been typical from someone facing decades in prison. "I spent months trying to convince myself that I was the victim of an elaborate setup, that you had somehow trapped me in crimes I didn't commit. But the truth is simpler and more damning. I destroyed myself through greed, arrogance, and the belief that other people existed for my convenience." The letter continued with a level of self-awareness that suggested genuine reflection rather than strategic positioning for appeal. I betrayed a friendship, seduced another man's wife, mocked him behind his back, and built my professional success on a foundation of lies and stolen money. The fact that you facilitated my exposure doesn't make me less guilty of the crimes I committed. Robert found himself surprised by the letter's honesty. The Craig Matthews who had written these words was a different person from the arrogant predator who had bragged about his conquest at the bachelor party. I'm writing to tell you that I understand now what real strength looks like. It looks like someone who has the power to destroy his enemies, but chooses instead to let them destroy themselves. It looks like someone who builds rather than merely taking, who creates value rather than just redistributing it. The letter concluded with a simple acknowledgement. You showed me what I could have been if I had made different choices. I can't undo the damage I've caused, but I can try to become someone worthy of the mercy you've already shown by not pursuing further revenge. Robert folded the letter carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. Even now, Craig was still trying to understand the man he'd so badly underestimated, still grappling with the realization that true power came from restraint rather than dominance. As the evening deepened, Robert reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. The quiet suburban life that had felt like exile had actually been preparation, teaching him patience, helping him understand the difference between strength and cruelty, showing him that the most profound victories came not from destroying enemies, but from building something worth defending. Victoria's hand found his, and they sat together watching the city that never slept